Okay, Jeff, everyone's in.
Okay, Michelle, thank you very much and welcome to everybody. I'm Jeff Gedman with American Purpose. This session today, as many of you know, is part of a 3-day virtual conference convened by American Purpose to mark 1 year American Purpose. This endeavor marks 12 months next month. When we were planning this, we planned it initially with 2 U.S. senators to take place on the Hill live, and then we moved to hybrid and we moved to virtual for reasons you all know and can understand. But when we planned this session, I had a couple friends actually who said, gosh, allies and alliances, are you sure? And of course, now we have this intense conversation between Americans, Europeans, NATO over the exit and evacuation of Afghanistan, a pretty rich conversation between Americans and French and Europeans over the submarine saga. And of course, this Friday, day after tomorrow, arriving in Washington, we have prime ministers from Japan, Australia, and India. This promises to be a timely and very important conversation. We have 75 minutes till 10:15 Eastern time, and a fabulous group managed by a fabulous moderator, Carla Robbins. Carla, great to see you and thank you for making time. You're a teacher, you're a professor, you're a research fellow, Council on Foreign Relations. You've done important service at the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, and you're a member of the American Purpose editorial board. I can't think of anybody better to scene set, introduce our guests, and really manage the conversation. We will take questions, put them in chat, or when Carla decides to invite you, feel free to raise hands using the raised hand function. But welcome to everybody. And Carla, your show. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Réka, Tom, Joe, and Michael. I am, and all of our friends and colleagues who've been part of, these really important conversations. And you guys, Jeff and Michelle, have put on, as ever, an extraordinary show, which they've been doing since the beginning of this. So I'm going to take the liberty of dispensing with all of your many honorifics, if I may. I've got to sign off. Joe, is that okay with you? I got to sign off from Michael and Réka, and is that okay?
Just call me Joe.
Okay, I've known Joe a long time. I've called him many names over the years, and I hope that's okay with Tom as well. So we have a very limited amount of time. We have a star-studded panel, and I know that Tom has to bow out after 45 minutes, so I'm going to jump into it. Because I'm a journalist, I'm not going to let you guys filibuster. I'm just going to ask questions, and I want to stipulate to start that these have been really excruciating several weeks for those of us who hoped that a Biden presidency was going to restore some confidence in American global leadership, and especially the U.S. commitment to the transatlantic alliance. I mean, I've been, frankly, I've had a really upset stomach for quite a few weeks here. And as anxiety-filled as I am for the people of Afghanistan, I'm profoundly upset about the people of Afghanistan. I'm also profoundly upset about American global leadership. And then you have this thing with Australia and the French, which in the beginning, I must admit, I sort of thought, well, how Gallic of them. They're just peevish. But the more I've thought about it, the more I'm beginning to really fundamentally question what the hell's going on with this administration and what the hell is going on with the hope for American leadership. So we could spend a lot of time speaking bitterness, as the Chinese talk about, but we could also look forward. And my hope for our session this morning, both in the discussion among the five of us and in the Q&A and discussion session to follow, is that we might try to shed some light on as how we Americans and Europeans might move forward from this current despond. So Tom, can we start with you and talk about the NATO alliance after Afghanistan? Can you give us some damage assessment for the alliance and what needs to happen to move beyond it, and how much of that is an American responsibility and how much of that is a European and British responsibility?
Well, look, thank you very much indeed for that introduction. It's always a pleasure to be with such an honourable crowd. It makes me look good by comparison. So I'm delighted you've raised my boat as you brought the weight of your excellence to this gathering. This is a very odd time for us, because many of us thought that the change in leadership in the United States would, reset things in a slightly different way. Afghanistan, AUKUS, various other things have put that into perspective, as you put it there. And I think there are some issues that we really do need to think about, but I think we've got to be cautious about not overstating it. Look, NATO is still strong, okay? I mean, the NATO alliance is still fundamentally solid, and it's solid because actually it never was about arms sales or about the South Pacific. It was always about the North Atlantic, the clue's in the name, and it was always about the Musketeer Pact, one for all and all for one, that is at the heart of Article 5. Fundamentally, that was so because it was written, after all, as the joke goes, to keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. And in that, it's still successful. I'm not sure the last one is particularly necessary anymore, but it's still successful. And so I think it is, I think NATO is strong. But I think that the question for us all is, what does alliance mean today? And here, Carla, and I thought you were right about the questions you raised about the French on AUKUS. Look, I mean, personally, I'm delighted that the Australians are going to get a nuclear-powered submarine fleet. I think it's an important thing to do. I think the French certainly believed it was too in 2015-16 when they tried to sell them the nuclear-powered Barracuda class, and the Australians decided they wanted the diesel-electric version instead. So I don't think this is something that anybody disagrees on, but it's worth looking at what this means for France and why it is that we need to invest in the alliance. And the first is that the people who sold the submarine to the Australians, the French people who sold it, were the Atlanticist French. They were the ones who sold it to the Australians as a step towards rapprochement, as they would put it, with the United States, as a step towards being a global player, as a step towards being part of the sort of Anglosphere, if you like, but certainly the Americanosphere that many of them aspired to. So the reason you're seeing silence and quite a lot of anger out of France today is because the people who are most damaged by this are your closest friends. The people who are happy and crowing, they're the ones who said, I told you could never trust them. And there's a hell of a lot of I told you so's going around Paris at the moment. Now, none of this is final and none of it, has to be disastrous, but it does mean that we need to think again about what we're talking about. Because frankly, if AUKUS ends up being just a submarine deal, that's a wasted opportunity. What it needs to be is a partnership of democracies looking to defend themselves through technological cooperation over the longer term. And if it is that, then it better start bringing in Japan and Germany and France and India quite soon, because the reality is that we need all of us to be playing. We need all of us to be cooperating to turn this around. There's also a danger, and this is a separate but I think important connected point, that if we think that the challenge from China is military, we haven't understood the economics. And so it is, of course, true that the military commitment of NATO is important. It's also, of course, true that having Australia able to defend itself and its waters is important. But actually, the fundamental role of not just the United States, but also the United Kingdom, Australia, the European Union, others, is to build up a protective partnership of democratic trading states, to learn the lesson from GATT, which was, let's not forget, set up in the 1940s as the financial underpinning, as an alternative to what was no longer, but effectively was the continuation of Comintern. And so we need to be looking at ways of defending the rules-based system through economics, not just through military means. And if we end up being just a military partnership, we've really missed a trick, and we probably are going to find ourselves outspent. I can't hear you, I'm afraid.
Yes, I try to be well-behaved and muted myself. Can you explain, why this was done under stealth of night? I mean, why was it necessary to trick the French, not tell them what was going on? And couldn't they have been given a piece of this deal rather than have pissed them off so much, and so that now we have to try to bring them in after the fact and make amends? And is this a sign of boy, the Biden people are just really bad at this stuff? And we thought that the adults were back in the room and doing diplomacy. And I mean, Tony Blinken speaks French. We thought he understood these people.
Well, look, I mean, the problem you've got is this is quite a large defense contract. And the moment you look at alternatives, funnily enough, the incumbent is going to start getting lawyered up and cross. Although I have to say, this is one of those areas where I have a little bit less sympathy for the French, because if you read the proceedings of the Australian Parliament, which I know we all do daily, you'll see that they began talking about this months ago. And in fact, the Defence Minister, Hutton, was talking to the Australian Parliament in June, talking about having contingency options. Now, I mean, that's not quite saying we're going to go with another supplier, but to have a defence minister talking about contingency options on a 90 billion Australian dollar contract, I mean, you must have gone quite a long way down the path before you're talking about it publicly, right? So, I mean, it's true that the French weren't told. It's not entirely fair to say that they had no inkling.
So on Afghanistan, and to go to the bigger question here, I mean, you guys, of course, can feel that way because you guys were in the tent and they were out of the tent. But last time I checked, your government was really peevish about Afghanistan and felt that you hadn't been adequately consulted. So you were sort of in the place where the French are now talking about it. Everybody seems to feel as if they were being fundamentally strong-armed by this administration, whether it's on Afghanistan or on the AUKUS deal. How profound is this dismay? Is it something that's going to pass? And how do we get past this, or is it not possible? Because let's keep in mind, this is coming after 4 years of the Trump administration, which, the sin against which all others are measured, which is basically said, forget Article 5. But it also comes after 8 years of the Obama administration, which people began to really feel as if, maybe didn't care that much about Europe. So how do we get past this, or can't we not get past it?
So look, I think you're right to bring the last two presidents into this, because this isn't a standalone issue, right? I mean, this isn't something that started yesterday. And, I think the UK's response to some of the Afghanistan withdrawal was, I mean, frankly, a bit like the French response to the submarine deal, was a bit unfair. I mean, the reality is President Obama changed the deal when he put the time limit at the time of the troop surge. President Trump signed the instruments of surrender in whenever it was, November 2020. And President Biden ran on a ticket of leaving Afghanistan. So we can't really claim we didn't know. I think what we can say is, look, this is quite a difficult thing to manage, and it would have been helpful had we been brought into the management of the withdrawal process, and that's proven. But to say that we didn't know, no, we did know. I mean, there's no doubt about it. And there's huge amounts of criticism internally, which quite understandably probably hasn't crossed the ocean to you. Criticism internally about who did what when and why, because, frankly, quite a lot of our agencies and departments look, maybe this is unfair, but certainly look as though they were flat-footed in time of major national emergency or major international emergency. So I think that there's, I'd just be careful about blaming everything on the Biden team. I certainly do think it comes as part of a continuity. That said, the alliance between us is exceptionally deep and exceptionally strong, because it's not actually about the White House and number 10. It's about the fact that we, broadly speaking, see the world in a similar way through free trade, through cooperation on defending democracy and basic liberties and so on. So I do think that still applies. Your point, however, that it still needs work is absolutely valid. I mean, there is always a danger in any large country that it feels that it can take the interests of others less into account. This is not an anti-American point. This is simply a fact that large countries, which have domestic politics, feel quite understandably that they have to respond to their own domestic politics before they respond to others. That's a perfectly reasonable point. Of course they should. but their own domestic politics will also be influenced by the way in which others perceive them. So the defeat in Afghanistan, it's a defeat. And I'm perfectly prepared to accept that Americans don't think very much about Afghanistan anymore, but Americans, like Brits, don't like being defeated. The same is true of, the actions against the French. I know that France isn't everybody's favorite country in the United States, and there are some legacy issues there that we can go over. But the reality is Americans do like having trading partners in the European Union and influence in areas like, the commercial underpinnings of their economy. So, be careful where you push, because other people react in their own ways as well. And I think there is a theme here, which is, there is a growing sense of nationalism and a shrinking internationalism amongst all partners. And while it is harder for the bigger ones, it is important that the bigger ones show a lead.
Carla, should we extend the discussion a little bit?
Yes, we can. I wanted to move on to Réka, and I was focusing on Tom because he's going to be leaving us, but please, Joe, jump in.
Oh, no, that's not
No, absolutely, Joe, jump in, please. I had questions for you as well.
My view on the alliance is like Humphrey Bogart and Ingrid Bergman, where he says to her, "We will always have Paris. We will always have the alliance for a very simple reason. The U.S. is the security lender of the last resort, and the Europeans, for various different reasons, cannot bring to bear their enormous resources on a kind of strategic and turn it into strategic weight." So that's the basic thing. Now, as to the most recent crisis, we've heard that we should extend this to past squabbles. What we often forget is that Trumpism, this kind of retrenchment and forget the Europeans, begins with Obama. And I'm not saying that to accuse Obama or to exculpate Trump, but simply to show that something has changed in the general American outlook, which Obama described so nicely when he said, free riders aggravate me. And it's time for a little nation building at home. True for Trump too, etc. And the withdrawal from Europe actually began under Obama. So there's a pattern here which transcends whoever sits in the White House. When it comes to unilateralism, which, as Tom said, is what great powers do. We've passed through worse crises. For instance, when the Americans forced the Brits and the French out of Suez, that was a bit bigger item than what we are talking about. And the French, of course, might say unilateralism is us, and the list is endless. So this is just for perspective to show how similar or worse problems have kept the alliance going, but and the French are making the best or the worst out of it. My question then is to the rest of the panel: does America and Europe have alternatives? Will they go their own ways? Will, as we've heard for the last 15 years, will there be this pivot toward Asia, forget the Europeans? I don't think so, because the grand strategic alternatives aren't there, unless the Europeans do something which I don't think they'll be able to do very soon, which is to turn their magnificent resources. I mean, they have as many men under arms as the United States. It's the second largest economy in the world, larger than the Chinese. Will they turn it into a strategic actor? And that's why I want to leave and trigger the discussion. There, I don't think the Europeans will be able or are willing to do that. And so they'll continue to suffer some of these humiliations. Like, for instance, EU citizens cannot travel to the United States. but Americans can travel to Europe. Those are indignities which to me are a bit more practical right now than whether the French have lost the submarine deal.
Joe, I want to come back to this question of strategic autonomy. It was actually the question I had focused on you, but before we do that, because
I preempted you. I was unilateralist.
That's won't be the last time. Réka, and to continue on with the, sort of the question that Joe itself raised, is there, how big is the damage? How lasting is the damage in your perception of it? Is there any way for the Biden administration to smooth over what's going on? And, the Russians and the Chinese have been luxuriating in this, in Afghanistan, Schadenfreude in particular. Putin's national security advisor, Patrushev, told Fred Kemp, my old journal colleague, a few weeks ago, that one of the lessons of Afghanistan is that the Ukrainians shouldn't rely on the Americans, because the White House may not even remember about its supporters in Kyiv. And the China's Global Times predicted that once a war breaks out in the Taiwan states, the US won't be there to help. In Central Europe, this sort of trash talk from Moscow certainly isn't new, but are people looking at, Afghanistan as a sign that the Americans just aren't going to be there? Or do they see this sort of as a passing squall? And, can the Biden administration recoup from the last few weeks?
Thanks, Carla. And it's really the big question, I think, or these are the big questions that we all are trying to understand in Central Europe. And I think what I would like to take the angle that I would like to take in this one is really a Central European one, because I think it's a special one inside the alliance. And I think Joe is right to say that Obama is the starting point. I think that's when the first big sort of breach of trust really took place. And that really hit the Central Europeans in particular, and the Atlanticists in Central Europe, who were seeing this as a major defeat on their sort of Atlantic values. And also whose opponents domestically were seeing it as a proof to say, yeah, this is, the situation. So ever since then, we see a series of decisions and steps which just reinforce this image of the US being ready and quick to throw its allies under the bus, and it has been over successive administrations a repeated pattern. So the problem is deeper, I think, and wider. And the lack of understanding between, or the lack of common grounds between the two perceptions of Atlanticism is worse. So on one hand, I think when I hear all these comments or analyses that we have always had troubles in the transatlantic alliance and we've always overcome this, and that has been taking place before, I'm not sure if the situation is really the same now as with any previous discourse. What I can see, especially in Central Europe, is I think, from a European perspective, there is, I think, a lack of what concerns me most, and what is the most scary thing of it, is that there's a lack of understanding really of how far Western Europe has gone in threat perception from the US. I think it's really a very different planet. If we talk with security policy decision makers or analysts in most of the big capitals, you do find, of course, people who are exceptions to the trend, but in general, the threat perceptions are very, very different. And so even now, with a stronger feeling of the concern about China, it's not the same concern about China as what you can see in the US. And the scariest thing in this is not that these are just, very diverging threat perceptions, but that Washington is not aware of it. And I think that's a problem, because then Washington is gonna, so we have had surprises before in Washington of this divide. But there will be more, and I think the more, the worse. So that is one problem. On the other hand, I think from a Central European perspective, there is a two-way development in the region, and we don't seem to understand this two-way development inside the region when it comes to Atlanticism. On one hand, we see the troubles, the countries where the values are shaking, and when there's a lot of focus on about institutions and and commitments, and there's a constant discussion. But on the other hand, there's another development in the Central European context, which is, to me, as a Central European, is also striking. I have seen over the last 5-7 years, countries that have not been, let's say, overly enthusiastically, active or proactive in their Atlantic commitments before, have become stronger in their Atlantic system and in their desire to cooperate and in desire to strengthen the Atlantic cooperation. And I think that's a very important development. It's even more so that they are the ones, I think, who we should be starting to strategize with and understand, how we can reverse the negative trends in the region itself, or how we can see this together. And I think the most important element of the transatlantic cooperation is the one that is missing right now. If we can call this very sort of simplistically, the people. What we don't have now is not just leaders who are, who knows, and what, so I don't want to go into that, but yeah, there is a problem about leadership as well. And of course, there's a lot in every country to discuss about that. But I'd also mean, people, meaning analysts and security policy experts who are not discussing with each other, or very, very rarely. There's no intensive transatlantic dialogue about understanding the threats, about how we read Russia, how we read China, how we read the domestic developments on the transatlantic level. And also, we don't have a public opinion anymore. And I think that's a very serious problem, that we don't have the people behind us. Like I was, part of the campaign for Hungary's membership in NATO back in the early 90s, because we were preparing for a referendum. So I was traveling around the countryside, talking with doctors, teachers, all around to have the necessary support for NATO membership. I remember how fundamentally important it was to really make, create a mainstream opinion, make people understand what the value of this cooperation framework is. We don't have, and we used to have a lot of programs, of course, in the early 90s. We don't have those programs for over 2 decades now, which means there's an entire generation that is out of the regular monthly or whatever half a yearly discussion or meeting with experts. And I think this is the price that we are paying now. So I think it is it should be a big priority. So I think one of the challenges, or one of the issues that we should propose is to, how to overcome this bridge of perceptions, how to bridge this perception, how to overcome this divide in the threat analysis on the 2 sides of the Atlantic, how to develop a strong network of think tanks, of security policy experts on the 2 sides of the Atlantic, how to strengthen this people element that has to be in the discussion also. And I think, we might be in a lucky situation with the 2 big challenges of the decades ahead of us with Russia and China, because if we see it in a very practical way, Russia is certainly a challenge that the Europeans are not going to respond to on their own without the US. So they need the US's cooperation in that. But China is a challenge that the US is not going to be able to manage without the cooperation of the Europeans as well. So I think we have a mutual need of each other and the question is, do we understand it? And do we see it? Maybe that's enough to start now.
You raised a lot of really good questions there, and several of which I want to come back to, particularly this question about whether we have a shared threat perception, which seems like a really big issue. But before we come back to that, and particularly because Tom is going to be leaving us in a few minutes, but I want to get to Michael, and then we'll go back to Tom for one more round really, really quickly. So Michael, I'm going to ask you a big question, which I'm going to ask you to answer just to start your answer, and then we'll come back to you again on it because Tom's going to be leaving us. But Michael, you've written this big book, which is coming out which is much a way to diplomatic history of the US. Can you just start us off and say, is this just the Biden administration stumbling along, or is there some method, if not doctrine, at work here. Can you just put us very quickly to start, in what you've seen in the last few weeks of how this fits in?
Well, thank you, Carla, and thank you for mentioning my forthcoming book called The Four Ages of American Foreign Policy. I have some prepared remarks which encompass your question, among other things. Which you are
not going to do because you love me dearly, and this is not a prepared remarks forum.
Well, I am going to do them with your permission, but why don't I wait,
Michael,
and have
please
you
don't.
talk to Tom?
Michael,
first.
We don't have time for prepared remarks. We're having a conversation here, and Jeff will
these,
be angry at me.
These prepared remarks will not take longer than the comments that have already been made. But since Tom has to leave, why don't we go to him before I speak?
Okay, Tom, back to you. Tom is laughing.
This is what I love about dealing with our American friends. You have an ability to have blunt and straight conversations with each other and with your friends, and it's one of the many reasons I love you dearly. So thank you very much.
Well, hell, I'm a journalist. I'm blunt all the time. Tom, so you're a politician, okay? You guys are blunt behind closed doors. So I'm going to ask.
No, we're vicious. We're not blunt.
Okay, I'm going to ask you to. So they bring you into a strategy session in the Biden administration, okay? And they say, okay, we're sort of screwed here. We thought we came in, America's back. We're going to make nice to everybody. The only people who like us right now are you guys, the Brits, and the only reason you like us is because nobody else likes you. It's a
great line.
And you, Tom, you had a French wife. You sort of get the Europeans. We've done our Oppo research on you. So we brought you in. Tell us what we do now. Put your politician hat on as well as your strategic thinker's hat. Well, tell us what we do now, because one UNGA speech and $500 million on COVID vaccine, as important as that is, and that's incredibly important, ain't going to do it. Everybody is suddenly thinking, this is sort of, as the Europeans have started saying, this is Trump without Twitter.
Well, look, first of all, I think after my speech in August, I think the chance of me being invited is slim to none. I think I've now been banned by both great superpowers, China and the United States, but we'll see.
They don't have a lot of friends. I think you'll be back. You'll probably be at a state dinner in the next few months.
You may be right. Look, what I would say to the American government at the moment is you do actually have a lot of friends, and there are ways in which you can reach them. But actually, what people are looking for from the United States is, I'm afraid, what they always look to great powers for, and that's predictability. What they actually want is they want to know what the future is, broadly speaking, going to look like, so that they can take their own risks off the back of it. And at the moment, whether you are Polish or Lithuanian, whether you're British or Australian, the same question arises. What is US policy going to be like? Now, part of this, the Biden team can do a bit about, right? I mean, they can set out some strategy for the future, but part of them, they can't. I mean, President Biden is not a young man. Who's going to be the next president of the United States in 3 years is a fair question, in a way that it isn't always for a president who's only a year into their first, or less than a year into their first term, right? So this raises questions, because what people really want is they want confidence in the future. And that America is finding it hard to give right now. And so partly I don't blame the Biden team, and partly there's a bit that they can do in terms of setting out agendas, reinforcing existing alliances like NATO, and demonstrating their commitment to partners around the world.
Yes, but demonstrating their commitment to partners around the world is exactly what they haven't done in the last few weeks. So can you
they haven't, but
tactical, at least maybe tactical rather than strategic, what they should be doing?
Okay, I mean, there's some quick ones. Immediately make a very clear statement that you're going to underwrite the amount of money that is being taken off the Lithuanian government by the Chinese attempts at sanctioning over Taiwan. It's a few $1 million. I mean, in US terms, it's not even a rounding error. It's so small, it slipped out around the back of the sofa and nobody noticed. But it would make a huge difference to Lithuania, and it would demonstrate intent in the Baltic states and Eastern Europe. Start talking quite seriously about democracy in Hungary. You don't need me to tell you that there are many European powers who are increasingly concerned about the anti-democratic movements in Eastern Europe. Start talking quite confidently about not just technology transfers to Australia, but to Japan. Start talking quite strongly about what it means to have a permanent presence in South Korea. these are areas where the United States could have a very active role and make a very clear noise about, 9-dash lines, or rather the encroachment of 9-dash lines onto Philippines water or onto Indonesian continental shelves. The United States can have a voice here, backing UN treaties, backing UN statements, not expanding its own interests, but actually backing the institutions that we spent so many years building, starting in the 1940s. So I think there's a lot that the Americans can do tactically. And the reason that we would believe that in a way that we may not believe other elements is for the very simple reason that they are falling back on a long tradition of US, international, multinational sort of institution building, rather than on the, policies of an administration that may or may not have as long as some of us might hope.
Can I ask a final question, since you're leaving, and it's going to go into what Joe is going to talk about after Michael makes his prepared remarks? You see, I've caved here, but Michael's prepared remarks are not going to be 10 minutes. They're going to be 7 minutes, since no one has spoken more than 7 minutes, which is, strategic autonomy doesn't necessarily have to be a dirty word. I remember when it was a dirty word when it first came out. Why don't the Americans embrace the notion of European strategic autonomy? Why don't they send advisors? Why don't they help underwrite it? Why don't they say, okay, you guys, take your training wheels off, stand up for it. And, this rapid reaction force, which they've been talking about forever, would be a great thing for the United States. Why don't they, as one more thing on that list? And that too could be a rounding error, not as small a rounding error as the Lithuanian money, but when you look at the size of the US defense budget, it'd be a rounding error too.
Well, look, I think the Americans have done that. I mean, I would argue that since 1945, that's exactly the American policy, has been to try and get the Europeans to stand up in various different ways. The American interest in the European Union has been very much in trying to make sure that Europeans, are able to fund their own defense budgets, are able to cooperate and so on. If you look at the American work on NATO, it's been very much pushing Europeans to cooperate. And what we've seen, sadly, is not lack of US effort, but inability of Europeans to align. And I mean, I don't blame the European states on this. If you are a Lithuanian, it is not unreasonable to decide that you need some defensive capability that doesn't entirely rely on Germany or France, who may or may not act at a point when you need them, right? So, there is a whole series of reasons why European states don't act as one. Joe has touched on some areas, and there are plenty of others. But the United States has tried this. I think the reality is that strategic autonomy is what people talk about until they get the bill.
That's depressing. But I would dispute the notion. I think the Americans were very uptight and continue to be quite uptight, as much as they talk about they want the Europeans to buy smart bombs. They don't like the idea of the Europeans actually making their own decisions. I think it's time to embrace it, but that's my own editorial board position in it. But Michael, on to you.
Thank you, Carla. I have 3 general observations about alliances in general and the American alliance systems in particular. The first is that the American alliance system has not 1, but 2 purposes. It has the purpose of augmenting power by aggregating it, which is the traditional function of any alliance. But in addition, this alliance system, or these alliance systems, have the purpose of defending and promoting certain international principles and norms that go under the general heading of liberal. We're all familiar with them: freedom of the seas, freedom of commerce, national sovereignty, non-aggression. And it's important to stress this because this, after all, is what distinguishes the United States from China, the purpose of whose foreign policy, I take it, is simply to promote Chinese power so that the Chinese can do as much of what they want as they can without others interfering. This is what distinguishes the American alliance system. It's what attracts other allies, and therefore it's worth bearing in mind and emphasizing. Observation 2, all alliances are inevitably difficult to manage. What we're seeing now is nothing new, because there are 2 basic problems inherent in every alliance. One is a difference of interests. Allies have some interests in common, that's why they're allies, but they always have different and conflicting interests, and those have to be managed. The second inherent problem is burden sharing. Every ally wants to pay as little as possible for the common defense. This is sometimes known as the free rider problem. Every ally wants to be as free a rider as possible. That is unavoidable, and we see it in all three American alliance systems. In Europe, in the alliance against Russia, the Eastern Europeans are concerned about Russia, the Southern Europeans are not. The most important ally, the Central European ally, Germany, has mixed interests, and I would say also mixed feelings toward Russia. And as for burden sharing, the European allies are underperformers here and always have been. In East Asia, in the alliance against China, all America's friends and allies in East Asia wish for China not to dominate the region and are anxious for the United States to stand up to the Chinese, but they are all important trade partners with China. They don't want to jeopardize their economic interests, and therefore they are very reluctant to be out front in confronting China. And as for burden sharing, the principal military task in dealing with the Chinese is maritime, and only the United States has the maritime, that is the naval forces, capable of standing up to the Chinese. In the Middle East and the anti-Iranian coalition as well, there are differences of interest, although it's worth noting that these differences do not principally involve now attitudes toward Israel. And as for burden sharing, some of America's allies, although wealthy on a per capita basis, and although some of them have very advanced military equipment, are not really capable of using them. So this problem of alliance management, given these two structural inbuilt problems, is inevitable and will always be with us. The third and final point, and it goes to the question that has been discussed here, has to do with the American role. None of these three alliance systems will work without the United States taking a leading role. And here leadership really means the United States bears more than its fair share of the economic and military burden of confronting the three revisionist powers. In the American alliance system, unlike other alliance systems, it is the weak who exploit the strong. Donald Trump was not wrong about that. So the great question is whether the United States will continue to play its leading role in Europe, in East Asia, and in the Middle East. Now, the United States has played this role for 75 years, so there's some reason to think that this role will continue. On the other hand, we all know the reasons for skepticism, for doubt about its continuation. They have to do with international disappointments and domestic divisions. Will the United States continue to lead these alliances? We simply don't know. What we do know is that the answer to that question will shape, more than anything else, the future of international politics in the next decade and beyond. Thank you, and I trust that's under 7 minutes.
It was under 7 minutes, but I'm disappointed. I want an answer. Michael, you're never lacking in answers.
Okay, here's my academic non-answer.
I don't want an academic non-answer. I want Michael having lunch with me, giving me an answer.
Okay, for the first 150 years of American foreign policy between 1765 and 1915, the United States never imagined that it had any role in Europe. It actually was acting as a great power in the Pacific and even in China. Now, since 1915, almost everything important has changed, and yet it's worth noting that there is a tradition of non-involvement in American foreign policy and a tradition of Asia first. So my guess is that there will be momentum, there will be a faute de mieux attitude, As Joe said, there really isn't any choice. It's also true that beginning shortly after the Civil War, more and more Americans believe that the United States ought to play an important role in the world, and the segment of American society that continues to believe that is not small. And I would guess that everybody on this Zoom meeting belongs to that segment. So my guess is that it will continue in principle, but that doesn't tell us whether the United States and the alliances will be effective in coping with Russia, China, and Iran. My answer is, I think Americans in general, or at least the majority of Americans, will think that we ought to do so, which doesn't guarantee that we will. Thanks.
So Joe, I want to ask a question that Réka posed, and then we'll go back to Réka about this. You raised the question, which is, what's the alternative? And then Réka raised this notion of do we share the same threat perception, which seems also to be part of the what's the alternative question. So maybe I'm wrong on what the potential alternatives are. The Europeans could move more toward, we're sort of between the Russians and the Americans and the Chinese. We're sort of a little bit more neutral than we used to be because, we're not so sure about the Americans, and we've got really strong economic interests with the Chinese. And we don't find the Russians as threatening as we used to, because basically they're, sort of a minor power, and they're a great source of energy. There's that one alternative. The other alternative is they could truly, pursue more strategic autonomy. You said it was too expensive, but maybe they'll pull themselves, they're, up by their own, pull their socks up. What are the alternatives here, other than drift, or coming back into the fold? And how different are their threat perceptions? How much do you agree with Réka's rather chilling notion?
Well, obviously, the Easties, as we like to call them, being very close to their Russian friends, have a much sharper and worried threat perception, obviously, than Portugal or Spain has. So that makes for a natural divide between these two camps. I want to talk about, if I may, I want to shift to the Western side and look at the three main players. What script are these following? I would put it very briefly. The UK, when in doubt, you go with the United States. The French, when in doubt, you go with yourself. You kind of assume a splendid try to assume a splendid starring role on the international stage. Do your thing, but never really alienate the United States. And the Germans, when in doubt, well, they will always kind of protect the American relationship, but being where they are in the geography, which is a lot closer to the Russians, they will always try to take out reinsurance from Russia, old Bismarckian policy, and they will take out reinsurance from China as a country that is too far away to really threaten them directly. And in order to protect, for instance, the Germans, it's their largest trading partner, to protect their trading relationship. So all told, you have the three main players. When you want to talk about strategic autonomy, you have to ask, can these three big ones really gel together? Which I don't know, which I don't think so. Above all, the key power in this game, because it sits at the fulcrum of the European balance, is and has always been Germany. And the German instincts, as I just outlined, will be to have one foot planted on each side, with more weight being placed on the American alliance. If that's a correct assessment, then I don't see I see very little chance for strategic autonomy, especially since, again, in that difference that now joins France and Britain, these still have remnants of a warrior culture and remnants of a strategic outlook, which the Germans, for good reasons, as we all know, have ditched. They see themselves as the power of peace. They talk about their culture of strategic reticence. And given all that, I don't think that Europe will gel into something or into a player who will put its huge money reserves where its mouth is not, or maybe. And that to me is the limit, very stringent limit of strategic autonomy. As long as the United States maintains its umbrella, fraying as it may be, but look, for Lithuanians or Poles, one American battalion on the eastern border is worth more than a German division or a French division, because that's the superpower, which has credibility, which has the wherewithal, and which is ready to act strategically. Last point. One last look at the United States, very, very, very practical one. I think the brouhaha of the last couple of weeks makes me fear, and I hope to be corrected by you, that this is not a professional outfit. Professionals, when they see big ones coming up on the horizon, like the Australian taper or the Afghanistan withdrawal, do damage limitation beforehand, and not as Biden is now doing afterwards. So on a day-to-day practical level, I'm quite worried about the professionalism of this administration when it comes to grand strategy.
You know, this is for me the great surprise. You know, I explained Afghanistan as when the boss really wants to do something, it doesn't matter what the intel people tell you, the diplomats tell you, what everybody else tells you, because the boss basically has his fingers in his ears and is singing the Star Spangled Banner. You can't, you know, once, okay, even though it's a transcendently important issue, twice in a few weeks, you know, with this Australia thing. I mean, this one you could have seen this one coming. They're not doing their homework, which then raises this question of,
so
I don't get it.
You and I agree.
We're so rarely in agreement, and we are in agreement, and it scares the hell out of me. These were supposed to be the grown-ups. And the brilliant ones also. And I certainly, I don't get it. I mean, Réka, we got questions in there, but I really want to, you know, just one really quick round with you and Michael, and then, you know, pitch questions to you guys directly as well from the group. Can you just really quickly develop this notion of threat perception, and is it true that strategic autonomy wouldn't be adequate to make you guys feel safer?
To whom
I'm asking Réka. I'm asking Réka the question.
Okay.
Sorry, no. Yeah, I think this is a very sort of already strongly rooted experience in many of the Central European countries. You know, the understanding of what Russia means in their own environment varies deeply from a strong concern, of course, of the Baltics and of Poland, and then ending up in a situation like Hungary, where it is explicitly expressed by several of the top decision makers that no, Russia is not an immediate threat to the country. Going to the China question is even more clear, and that is on a wider European level, that yes, while there is now some concern about China's motives and China's strategy in the world, ultimately, the threat as a threat, you know, China is really not on the horizon for most of the European decision makers. And I think that gap has been widening over the time and deepening. And the resulting situation in which we're now is that we're talking two different, you know, discussions here and in the, here in the US and in many of the European capitals. And that, I think, is a fundamental impediment of, you know, how to go forward if we have that. I'm honored to have Professor Mandelbaum as my professor at SAIS. I'm very excited to be on a panel with him, and I'm very happy to be here. And your classes were just, fantastically, insightful at the time. And I very much enjoyed also your comments now on the alliances. I think that's also very much to the point. What you said about, allies, of course, on the burden sharing question, wanting to contribute with as little as possible. I think that is absolutely, that was true for the Europeans for a long time. Now, most recently, some of the Central Europeans, some Europeans obviously as well, some of the Central Europeans have made strong efforts to increase the budget, to contribute more. But of course, what this adds up to is really still, even if they go up to the 2% or, say even more to the common defense, it's really on the contribution is going to be still on the margins. So, but they have made a commitment, and there is an effort, there is a gesture which has not been, politically rewarded, yes, but strategically not taken as a message or not taken into the discussions. So I think the situation of lack of understanding of what the real threats are, a common understanding of the real threats, and lack of real interaction of going forward and what directions to go forward has now come to a situation when I have very big concerns about getting over this. And I think this opens up a huge possibility for malign actors to get into the transatlantic dynamics and weaken it from the inside.
Thank you. A question from Jeffrey Kerf, which is perfect for Michael Mandelbaum. It's about Iran. Michael's written a lot about Iran, including for American Purpose. I'm going to shorten the question. You can read it in chat. How seriously does Michael, we know you take the Iran threat quite seriously. Quite a few of us do. How seriously does the Biden administration take the Iran threat? And are they going to do enough to prevent it?
Thank you. Let me make two comments, one of which is directly on point. The first comment is that most of the discussion here has been about NATO and the American alliance system in Europe. In my judgment, that has no higher than third priority with the United States. China is the most important threat. Iran is the most urgent one. Russia comes third. Also, I think for reasons that I won't go into because we don't have time, I think the American public and the American political class is considerably more put off and annoyed by the European underperformance in contributing to the common defense than it is to the underperformances in East Asia and in the Middle East. And that, incidentally, is a reason that for the Europeans, especially the Eastern Europeans, to do more by way of defense, even if it doesn't make much of a contribution to actual capabilities, is extremely important symbolically and therefore politically in the United States. Now, to come to Jeff's important question. The most important question that any country faces in its foreign policy is when and how to use force. And that is particularly important for the United States, which is the tip of the spear in the Middle East, as well as in Europe and in East Asia. However, this is an administration and it represents a party, the Democratic Party, which is increasingly uncomfortable with the use of force, so uncomfortable that it insists that the most important foreign policy problem that the United States faces has nothing to do with Russia, China, or Iran, but is climate change, global warming. Therefore, although I have no direct information whatsoever, this is purely my speculation based on reading the paper, I fear that the Biden administration hasn't answered that question in general or specifically when it comes to Iran. And it's coming to a point at which, in order to vindicate the promise of the last three administrations to prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons, the use of force will have to be contemplated and perhaps used. I hope I'm wrong about this, but my sense is that this, and again, let me emphasize, I have no direct information. My sense is that this administration is unprepared for the challenge that is coming down the road from Iran.
Can I add something to that?
Please, and then we want to get on to Patrick.
Don't we have, isn't there kind of tacit division of labor between the US and Israel? One playing the bad cop, one playing the good cop. And for the United States, it's actually quite comfortable to have an ally or kind of continental sword, if you wish, in the Middle East, who is willing and very skilled about it to use sub-strategic force to halt, break, or discourage the Iranians. So if the administration were thinking in these realpolitik terms, I would be reasonably assured, because it's a kind of an interplay between the regional and the global player. What I don't know, that none of us knows, is whether they even think in these terms. They should, but I don't know, because as we just heard, they act as if they didn't care that much about Iranian nukes. And so that tacit alliance between Israel and the United States could break up over the point where the Israelis are convinced we cannot expect any support, any backing,
Joe,
and we have to do it on our own.
Joe, I think it's wrong to say they don't care about it. I mean, certainly the National Security Advisor spent an enormous amount of time on the Iranian nuclear deal. I mean, I think they care a lot about it, I think, and they're quite conscious of it. Whether they have the diplomatic or military capacity to figure out a strategy at this point, the last few weeks have been very nerve-wracking about that. I think that is the question. And there's, this is one of those.
Michael thinks they don't care that much, or did I misunderstand him?
Michael said it wasn't their number one priority.
I think you have correctly summarized my view, Joe.
I think they.
Well, that all great minds think alike.
Yes, certainly the male minds here. Okay, Patrick, on to you.
Thank you. My question is about the role of Turkey within NATO. It seems that there is a growing divergence on what Turkey's policy are leading to, and between most Europeans on one hand and the US on the other. And I wonder, what will really make the US no longer support Turkey within NATO and maybe wish for its departure. So it's to everyone on the panel.
Well, let me offer an answer. I think Turkey is in NATO like a member of a club that doesn't pay his dues. It's annoying, you can't count on it. He doesn't get all the privileges, but it's too much trouble to kick him out. And anyway, there's the hope that someday maybe he will, which in this case means there's a hope that someday Erdogan will be gone and a more sympathetic government will be in power, and therefore the best thing to do is to grin and bear it, or grimace and bear it.
Grim and bear it.
Anybody else on the? I mean, this raises the further question of and which Tom had said that the Biden administration should speak out much more forcefully about the question of democracy in Hungary. NATO doesn't spend a lot of time thinking about kicking anybody out, and while Hungary, the EU treaty does have Article 7, it's impossible, absolutely impossible to trigger Article 7. Would it matter if the Biden administration spoke out about democracy in Hungary? Is the EU prepared actually to take any action against its own recalcitrant members, let alone NATO taking action against its recalcitrant members? Réka, do you think it would have any impact on Hungary if the Biden administration spoke out about democracy in Hungary?
Well, if you wanted to have a it would help the government win the election, certainly.
Okay. Anybody, Joe, Michael, what do you think about that?
Look, both the EU,
Sorry, go ahead, Joe.
Both the EU and the United States are walking on eggshells here for the reasons that need no further elaboration. The EU has a kind of threat over Hungary and Poland by withholding lavish support payments. The United States doesn't have that. So I wonder how the United States could, beyond the rhetoric, a pro-democratic rhetoric, actually put pressure on these two outliers in the East. Since I don't think so, I think we'll have the same kind of ambiguous situation where, we have the columnists write about those anti-democrats, but the governments themselves will be a bit more reticent in castigating them. Especially the Bulgarians always try to play both sides. They're trying to sidle up to China, trying to sidle up to Russia. And that puts another limit on how hard we can go, how hard we can be on Budapest.
I would like to jump in for a second here, because I think the constant sort of putting and treating together these two countries, Hungary and Poland, is really counterproductive. And it's not helping us to understand how to go forward and how to reach out, how to, what to do next. I think there are huge differences. And I think one of the lessons that we should sort of see from the situation from the relationship towards Hungary is that at every intersection point, when there was kind of a choice, what way to go, things were pushed to the more to the sort of the worst side, and decisions were going negative over the past couple of years to a large extent because of the lack of insight of critiques of Europe and of Hungary in particular. And I think I would really warn against making the same kind of path towards Poland. I think there are the fundamental difference of Poland's Atlanticism and Poland's commitment or interest, proactive foreign policy towards strengthening the alliance is a value that should not be underestimated, nor should it be taken for granted. And if there's anything to learn from the past few years of how things could go so wrong and how things could develop so negatively, it's certainly that of being a lot more sort of free and relaxed about civilizational and cultural issues, and a lot more focused on strategic issues. And I would like to sort of set our priorities right and say, our strategic cooperation with Poland is by far the most important thing, something that we really have to value. Poland has an extremely important strategic role in NATO, not just in Central Europe, but in NATO as well, especially because of the problems that we are witnessing with France and Italy and Germany. I think, and the lack of, the UK in the European decision-making system makes Poland a very strong and very important partner to work with. I think, the priorities just have to be right in our discussions with Poland, in our interaction with Poland, and in our understanding of, how to treat the differences.
We have 4 minutes left. And we have a couple of very good questions here. And I want to give everybody a final Jeopardy 1 minute. So this is going to be a challenge here. So I love Bill Galston. I'm not going to call on him. Bill, I love you. And he's put in the chat a very good piece that he wrote. But Fritz Heinzen has raised a very important question. If you could, Joe, can you do this in a minute and a half? And so that everybody has a quick, less than a minute summary. What should we expect from the German elections, and who's going to be running Europe? Can you do that in 40 seconds?
Yeah. First of all, almost nobody in the United States knows the top contenders the way they used to know Willy Brandt or Helmut Schmidt. Second, what we have is a bunching together in the middle of the various parties, which to me suggests that no matter whether it's the Social Democrat who will be elected chancellor or the Christian Democrat, that it doesn't matter that much because coalition politics forces immobility and continuity on its members, and so whoever, and because German interests and the grand strategic scheme of things will remain the same, I expect no surprises either domestically, ideologically, or foreign policy-wise. So, as always, those Germans who gave the world so much trouble in the 20th century are again a pillar of continuity and status quo. That's reassuring compared to everybody else.
But without the strength of a Merkel.
That's true, but I think what we're going to get from whoever is going to be the man, it's going to be Merkelism plus.
So Michael, Final Jeopardy, your summary point.
I have none. I yield the balance of my time.
Yeah, come on, you always have a good insight.
Well, it hasn't occurred to me yet. I think that the chances of the collapse. Let me add one point. One important point about the persistence of the American alliance system is non-proliferation, because in East Asia, in Europe, America's friends confront a nuclear armed power, and in the Middle East, America's friends and allies confront a power that is heading pell-mell for nuclear weapons. It seems to be a geopolitical principle that only nuclear weapons can offset other nuclear weapons. Therefore, if America's friends and allies in these three regions were persuaded that the United States was no longer the reliable leader of the alliance, the result would likely be nuclear proliferation. Japanese and perhaps other nuclear weapons in East Asia, perhaps German and other nuclear weapons in Europe, and nuclear weapons everywhere in the Middle East. It has been a settled principle of American foreign policy since at least the 1950s to prevent this, on the grounds that this would be extremely dangerous. If the United States differs from its leadership position, we will then test the proposition of whether this deference, this recusal, will bring on nuclear proliferation, and if so, whether it will be as dangerous as we always have assumed it would be.
Wow, good and terrifying final insight. Thank you for that. Réka, 25 seconds. Summary point.
Yeah, I would go back to what we said. I think it's if we don't prioritize our strategic values and our strategic cooperation, we're risking really to losing more partners and more cooperation with in Europe with the allies than we would think.
Thanks. Joe, I leave it to you for a final thought.
This was a wonderfully intelligent discussion. We should have more of them.
Thank you. You guys were great. Thank you to Tom, who's no longer with us. Thank you to Michael, to Réka, to Joe, and to Jeff and to Michelle for convening us and for what has been a great conference and will continue to be a great conference. So
Bingo.
Thank you all so much. It's great to see you all.
Amen.
Bye.
Thank you, Carla. It's been great.
Thanks, everyone.
Sorry, Bill.
Thank you, Jeff.